Right now, most protein on Earth comes from animals that eat more than they produce. Cattle need acres of land, constant feed, and non-stop human management. But 2,400 years ago, farmers discovered something disturbingly efficient. A single pond that could produce serious protein, while mostly feeding itself. Square foot for square foot, it can outperform traditional cattle pasture. And once the biology locks in, the system begins running on its own momentum, which raises a strange question most people never think to ask. If this system is so effective, why is almost nobody in America using it? Imagine walking into your backyard and pulling fresh protein from water you barely manage. No weekly feed runs, no industrial supply chain, just a living system that keeps producing. The kind of quiet food security most modern households have completely forgotten. Because this wasn't a modern invention, it was ancient biological engineering. And it all began when farmers along China's Yellow River noticed something most people would have ignored. What they saw in the mud would quietly reshape food production for the next 2,000 years. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at a backyard pond the same way again. Subscribe now, because the next few minutes might completely change how you think about producing food at home. In the next minute, you'll see how an ancient system works in the modern world. It's a living ecosystem producing food in a small space. Ducks, fish, and nutrients working together. When built correctly, each part quietly feeds the next. Over time, the pond begins doing the work for you. No farmland or expensive infrastructure needed. A modest setup supports a productive biological cycle. This knowledge didn't start in modern agriculture. Versions of this were documented over 2 millennia ago, observed carefully and refined over generations. The underlying biology hasn't changed at all. It traces back to an observant farmer in 475 BC. Today we call it aquaponics, but the roots are deep. Bring this ancient wisdom to your own backyard today. In 475 BC, during China's turbulent spring and autumn period, a quiet observer was paying very close attention to the water. His name was Fan Li, a strategist, statesman, an unusually sharp agricultural thinker. And in his treatise, later known as the Yang Yu Jing, he documented something most farmers had completely overlooked. Each year, when the Yellow River flooded and then receded, the landscape briefly transformed. Each year, when the Yellow River flooded and then receded, the landscape briefly transformed. Fish were left stranded in shallow depressions across the floodplain. But instead of dying off, many of these fish continued to thrive in the trapped water. Most people saw temporary puddles and kept walking. Fan Li saw the early blueprint of a controlled food system. He noted that if farmers simply deepened those natural depressions and reinforced the edges, the fish didn't just survive, they reproduced. They reproduced, filling the ponds with new life, and they could be harvested whenever food was needed. This wasn't industrial farming. It was something far more subtle, partnering with what the land already wanted to do. Fan Li's writings became one of the earliest known blueprints for intentional fish cultivation. And over the following centuries, versions of these managed ponds quietly spread across rural China. For nearly 1,000 years, the system kept improving. Then one imperial decision forced farmers to reinvent the entire system almost overnight. In the 7th century, during the powerful Tang dynasty, a single imperial decision changed everything. The emperor's family name was Li, the same name associated with the common carp. Because of this linguistic coincidence, the common carp became a sacred taboo. Out of respect and superstition, farming common carp was suddenly forbidden. forbidden across the empire, and overnight, farmers lost their primary pond fish, a protein source they had relied on for generations. The economy of the village pond was shattered. By all logic, this should have crippled small-scale fish production. But innovation often thrives under pressure. Instead, Chinese farmers did something far more intelligent. They found a way to use the entire pond. They stopped relying on one fish and began raising several species together. This was the birth of polyculture. Mud carp worked the bottom sediments. They cleaned the pond floor while they grew. Silver carp filtered microscopic algae through the middle water column. They acted as the pond's natural purification system. Grass carp consumed floating and shoreline plants near the surface. They kept the weeds in check, turning plants into protein. And bighead carp targeted the zooplankton most systems leave unused. No energy was wasted in this new vertical economy. Each species occupied a different ecological niche. They didn't fight for resources, they shared the space, which meant almost no competition and almost no wasted nutrients. The waste of one species became the fuel for another. Incredibly, the forced change made their ponds even more productive. The protein yield skyrocketed beyond anything seen before. What began as a political problem accidentally created the world's first true polyculture fish system. It was a masterpiece of accidental ecological engineering, and over the next several centuries, Chinese farmers quietly refined the method into a remarkably stable food engine that fed millions, which makes what happened next in the Western world even more surprising. While the East mastered diversity, the West took a very different, more rigid path. At first glance, it almost looks too simple to be this effective. But the secret is something biologists call niche stacking. Different organisms occupy different layers of the same water, each one feeding in a slightly different way, which means they are not competing for the same resources. And when competition drops, efficiency rises fast. In most farming systems, waste is a problem. Unused nutrients simply leave the system. But inside a balanced pond, that waste becomes food for something else. Microorganisms and tiny life forms begin to multiply and expand almost immediately. Small fish move in to harvest that explosion, and larger fish follow right behind them. What you're seeing is a closed nutrient loop. The more complete the loop becomes, the less human intervention the system requires. Given time, the biology begins regulating itself. Not perfectly, but far more efficiently than most people expect. However, this is exactly where many backyard ponds quietly fail. Because if one part of the biological chain gets out of balance, the entire system can begin drifting in the wrong direction. And in a moment, I'll show you the simple adjustment that keeps the whole ecosystem stable. But there is one mistake that quietly destroys most backyard ponds. And when it happens, the system doesn't fail slowly. It collapses fast, catching you completely off guard. Water clarity drops, oxygen levels swing, and algae can suddenly take over the entire pond. The worst part is most people don't see it coming, because the failure usually starts with one small imbalance. Sometimes it's too many fish, sometimes it's not enough plant filtration, and sometimes it's simply too much input for the system to process. Because this pond only works when the biology stays in balance. The good news is that the fix is usually simple once you understand what to watch for. And the ancient farmers who perfected this system learned how to stabilize it surprisingly well. In fact, modern fishery researchers eventually put these old methods to the test. And what they documented in controlled ponds caught a lot of people off guard. caught a lot of people off guard, because under the right conditions, these small ponds were producing far more than most experts expected. Because under the right conditions, these small ponds were producing far more than most experts expected. By the 1960s, a small group of American fishery scientists working in their labs decided to test these old pond ideas for themselves. At Auburn University in Alabama, controlled pond experiments quietly got underway. One of the key figures behind the work was fisheries scientist H.S. Swingle. Instead of theory, his team built real test ponds and tracked what actually happened. Some of these ponds were surprisingly small, around 1,000 square feet. They stocked them with hardy species like bluegill and channel catfish swimming below. Then they stepped back and waited and let the biology do most of the work. At first, the results looked modest, then the numbers spiked dramatically. In the most efficient traditional ponds, fish were only part of the system, because the real biological engine often floated right on the surface. As ducks swim, their feet gently stir the bottom sediments. That movement releases trapped nutrients back into the water column, which immediately feeds the microscopic life at the base of the food chain. And like all waterfowl, ducks continuously fertilize the pond, adding small but steady amounts of nitrogen to the ecosystem. That nitrogen feeds algae and zooplankton almost immediately, which directly supports faster fish growth below the surface. This is what makes the system so efficient. Every layer supports the next. But the ducks themselves add another surprising advantage. Productive breeds like khaki Campbell's are exceptional egg layers. A single duck can produce roughly 280 to 340 eggs per year. A small backyard flock quickly adds up to a serious amount of food, and with pond access, ducks can forage a meaningful portion of their own diet. Insects, aquatic plants, and duckweed all help reduce supplemental feed. So the ducks are not just livestock, they are active managers of the pond environment. But even with ducks helping drive the nutrient cycle, the system still depends on one critical form of natural filtration. Because without the right aquatic plants in place, even a well-stocked pond can slowly drift out of balance. In our next segment, we'll explore the plants that complete this biological circle. This is where the pond quietly cleans itself. In traditional systems, cattails were never just decoration. Their dense root systems act like biological filtration grids, pulling excess nitrogen and phosphorus directly out of the water, which helps prevent the runaway algae blooms that destabilize many backyard ponds. Surface plants like water lilies add another layer of control. By reducing heat buildup and slowing evaporation during hot months, below the surface, submerged plants quietly release oxygen during daylight hours, supporting healthier fish and more stable water chemistry. But one floating plant is almost unbelievably efficient. Duckweed. This tiny plant is a natural powerhouse. Under the right conditions, it can double its biomass in under 48 hours. It pulls dissolved nutrients out of the water at remarkable speed, and ducks will happily harvest it as fast as it grows, turning excess nutrients into a continuously renewing food source. In controlled systems, aquatic plants can remove the majority of dissolved nitrogen waste, which is one of the key reasons these ponds can stay stable with minimal intervention, because even the cleanest water won't produce food unless the right fish strategy is in place. And this is where species selection quietly determines whether your pond becomes moderately productive or surprisingly powerful. Fast forward 10 years into the future. Most households are still watching food prices creep higher, still reacting to supply shocks they can't control. But your backyard operates on a completely different timeline. The system is quiet, stable, and largely running on its own biology. When you want fresh protein, you simply harvest. Eggs appear steadily in the background of your routine. No urgency, no weekly scramble, no dependence on fragile supply chains. Not because you disconnected from the modern world, but because you built margin. The kind of quiet advantage most people never think to create. Just water, sunlight, and a biological loop that has been working for millennia. The smartest move is finally noticing what has been working quietly all along. At this point, the entire system comes down to one decision: choosing the right fish for your climate and goals. For most of the United States, bluegill are one of the easiest starting points. They are hardy and adapt to various pond sizes. They reproduce naturally in ponds and require very little active management. Most reach harvestable size in roughly 2 years under normal conditions. If you want faster growth, channel catfish are another proven option. In a balanced pond, they can reach 1 to 2 pounds in about 18 months. They also help utilize the lower zones of the pond. Tilapia grow even faster and are popular in warm regions. Under good conditions, they can reach around 1 pound in just 5 to 6 months. But this is where many beginners make a costly mistake. Tilapia are restricted or regulated in some states because they can become invasive. So always check your local fish and wildlife regulations before stocking. When species are matched correctly to your environment, the pond begins to stabilize. By the end of the first year, you may start seeing harvestable fish, depending on your setup. And if you leave a healthy breeding population, many ponds begin partially replenishing themselves. This is usually the moment when the system stops feeling theoretical and starts feeling very real. Because once you understand the biology, the next step is surprisingly practical, actually building the pond itself. Once the biology makes sense, the physical build is surprisingly straightforward. Start by choosing the lowest natural point on your property. You want water to flow toward the pond, not fight to escape it. Aim for a location that gets roughly 6 hours of sunlight per day, but avoid areas that bake in full sun all day. For most families, a modest footprint works extremely well. Around 10 by 15 feet is a proven starting size. Depth matters more than most beginners expect. Aim for roughly 4 to 5 feet at the deepest point, and include a shallow shelf around the edges for aquatic plants. If your soil contains heavy clay, you may be able to seal the pond naturally. Packed clay has been used successfully for thousands of years. But sandy or rocky ground usually needs extra help. In those cases, an EPDM rubber liner is the reliable modern solution. Quality liners often last 20 to 30 years when installed properly. Once filled, give the water time to settle and stabilize before adding life. Because what you add first, and the order you add it, determines whether the system stabilizes smoothly. And this is exactly where many first-time pond builders accidentally throw the whole ecosystem out of balance. At this point, most people start asking the same practical question: what happens when the pond freezes? In many climates, species like bluegill and catfish handle winter well by entering a semi-dormant state. The key requirement is keeping a small opening in the ice to allow oxygen in and harmful gases out. In colder regions, a basic pond de-icer handles this easily, ensuring winter stability for your fish. Warm water species like tilapia are the exception. They typically cannot survive below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of this, they are usually harvested in cooler climates before the winter temperatures arrive. Legality is another concern, but small backyard ponds are often considered private water features. Regulations usually focus on species choice, so checking with local wildlife agencies removes any uncertainty. Once those basics are checked, the system itself is surprisingly low drama and begins to manage itself. After the first year, it shifts from something you manage into a self-sustaining ecosystem.